Hi, my name is Bruce Boulder, and I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, dedicated to promoting a strategic and systematic approach to the management of people across the enterprise. And the show is all about the different issues, strategies, and frankly, how to implement stakeholder capitalism. So, on that subject, I'm very happy to have today Kent Gregoire. He's founder of a company called Stakeholder Business. He's been at this almost as long as I am, a little older than he is. But he's actually started a company decades ago focused on helping companies implement the process of stakeholder capitalism at the most practical level. So we're going to focus on that, but we're also going to go over a little bit of history about this field and how he got into it. I always need to take a moment to thank the various companies that do business with us and whose obviously investment in our services gives us the opportunity to share expertise of people like Kent Gregoire's. And then finally, always remember, we are stakeholder capitalists ourselves. We're committed to giving away lots of free information, just helping people get started on this path to better business. So I'm going to stop the share now. And Kent, thank you so much for joining us from beautiful Vermont.
Great to be here, Bruce.
So, Kent, when I went into your background, I really was astounded at your early commitment to conscious capitalism, even I believe before conscious capitalism was founded by John Mackey officially. Just tell us, how did you get into that, and what made you decide to start a business to help companies implement it?
Sure. Well, yeah, my journey has been long and many different industries, lots of experience, both leading companies that I founded as well as working with clients. And along the way, I really began discovering some challenges that were seeded in me by my own father. And those were to, really like return to purpose is how I would describe it today. One of the real things that he said to me that caught me at surprise, but, set a seed of momentum in me at a young age was I was running one of my first big companies. And he said, wow, you've really don't have your priorities right in business and life. That's something you need to be paying attention to. And from that moment on, I started digging in more deeply and realized that business was more than just turning a profit. Well, profit's essential to doing the mission of the business. He had a much deeper relationship with his own stakeholders. And briefly, one quick story. I love to tell this one because it, even for me, brings back, I can vision exactly these experiences. And that is, he would bring home suppliers, he'd bring home customers to our dining room table. And oftentimes with very little notice to my mother, and she'd whip up a great meal. The engagement of those conversations were what began to help me understand what it was like to engage with stakeholders in a way of understanding what their needs are and helping them be successful. So too often that I saw later in life is that people would always be asking their stakeholders, what can you do for me? What can you do for me? Give me better prices, do this, do that. He used a very different approach, which created strong relationships. And when things got tough, they were there to help them through it. There were innovations, there were a lot of cooperation. And I know my father really enjoyed working not only with his suppliers and his customers, but all of his stakeholders were a very big part of his daily life.
So, of course, this is really about better business. And I think this is where the whole issue has become confused, but I'm going to ask you about that. So, don't you think, in a funny way, Kent, having started, I believe, this company 37 years ago, it's not just a bright, shiny object, it's a commitment to a system. Weren't you ahead of your time?
Yeah, I was definitely ahead of my time. Stakeholder business itself isn't that old, but the work that I've been doing under the original company, which has just continued, is a long time. And I would say my approaches were ahead of time. I would work very what I would call today a more traditional type CEO. But where I had the advantage, and I didn't know this at the time, is many of these CEOs were, like I like to say, they were in the forest. They had kind of been at a pinnacle somewhere and they were in the forest. They'd come down on the backside of the mountain and just not really feeling good about where they were at. Isn't there really more to life? And so while they were still very profitable, they wanted to see that they could have some greater impact. Some of those same CEOs would say to me, I lost my mojo. And so as I began working with them, the ideas that I shared with them were very fresh. They hadn't heard them before, and they seemed to be much more interesting. And so they were very willing to be candidates to try out what it was that I was advising. And I was very fortunate. Clients had a lot of trust in me very quickly because our clients came from very trusted relationships that they had and referred them into us. So it was a really good symbiotic relationship. And for me, it was a lot like a test kitchen at first. Were the things that I was doing that were important to me, would others value that? And so originally, clients, and they actually decided to call me this, they would call me CEO to CEOs. And that's how I started in my career.
So you said something very interesting, that what spurred some of your clients was a question, I'm making plenty of money, but isn't there more to life? And it does seem that the early adopters of the concept of conscious capitalism, there's of shared values, there's the
Mhm.
economics of mutuality, the different groups that are trying, B Lab, they're all
Mhm.
dedicated to a similar process, just like in the world of TQM. But what's interesting here is that what you're saying is the early adopters are driven almost by a spiritual element, but when in the end, the true benefits are economic. Isn't that ironic? That ironically, you actually can earn more sustainable profits by running your business this way. Isn't that part of the confusion today that people are saying, oh, ESG, that means taking money away from shareholders to invest in, the pet peeves or pet interests of the CEO, and that's irresponsible. Therefore, we should forbid it. Isn't there something crazy about that?
Well, it could be crazy, right? Depending upon the viewpoint. I think that it's become known that we now have a responsibility as leaders. It's much greater than it was in the past. In the past, we thought, and many still today, that the primary purpose of a business is to make a profit. And again, I've never said not making profit. You have to make a profit in order to create impact on your larger mission. I would say it's more into redefining the success of a business. The game of business is being redefined. So, looking at not just the financial metrics around profitability, but developing collaborative relationships. When working with stakeholders, to have your stakeholders help in making the strategic decisions. Their voice at the table is really, really important. Helping people thrive in their life. If you can help people thrive in their life, not just at work, but also outside of work in the way in which the culture operates, that's a huge, huge gift to the individual. It helps with their growth. It helps in the family in which they're connected to, helps in their community. There's just so many benefits, we hear a lot about, and it's equally balanced inclusion and equity. Financial prosperity is no longer just for the business itself. It's thinking about prosperity for all the stakeholders, just like environment and community. Both are very important stakeholders, and then ultimately higher purpose. And if we are not anchored into higher purpose of solving a worthy problem and actually solving it and being able to measure the progress towards an environmental or perhaps a community-based improvement in solving it, so I shouldn't use the word improvement, you begin to look at a company and say it's very money focused. And so it's really redefining what does success look like in the game of business today to better respond to where we are as a society.
Well, and I think, and I, of course, doesn't matter, but I fully agree. But the thing that I've been at this effort for 40 years or more, and the problem, I think, is trying to fight it with a warm and fuzzy model. Because if the CEO and the board don't share those values, you're going to lose. But everybody in capitalism, and that's why it's called stakeholder capitalism, has to recognize that you're going to do better if your customers and your employees love you. Your father taught you that. He had built trust. How do you build trust? So this, to me, I think the argument, this is my own feeling, the argument can be made on an economic, it doesn't have to be made on a social justice issue. That, yeah, if you want to do it for that reason, great. But you're going to do better as a business. You'll have more sustainable profits, I think, if you address the needs of your stakeholders. A simple question, Kent. Do you think that today there are a lot of people, maybe 50% or more, who are making buying decisions, investing decisions, or whether to work at a company decisions based on how they feel that company treats people and the environment. Do you think that's become a competitive issue today?
Oh, it's become one of the primary competitive issues. And I think it's really interesting because the studies, the research that's done, the surveys that are done, and here, particularly in the United States, while I do look at what's happening around the globe, I'm really looking closely at the United States because that's where I'm more focused. And more than 2/3 of employees are very clear that they want to see that their employer is making an effort, actually doing what needs to be done to move the needle on environmental or a social issue. So, that's a really, really stark, number. But what was also interesting is during the pandemic, and I really go back to the beginning of it, where people started using their dollars with more intention. We saw a lot more money being available. So they were being more selective. They were using that money with real intention to the brands in which better represented who they are, from a values point of view, and what they represent. Um, and that's not going away. We continue to see that these measurements, month over month, seem to indicate that business is being asked to change. And so a competitive advantage by far is adopting to a new way of doing business, the new game of business.
Then my number one question to you, if we both agree that the economics, and I think all of the economics are clear, that there's a direct correlation between sustainable profitability, not
Right.
short term, you can make money short term by, we know, plenty of unethical means or barely ethical means, but sustainable profitability comes from having highly engaged stakeholders. There's no question. Why do, my question, two questions. Do you agree or not that most companies are not run strategically focused on the interests of their stakeholders? And if not, why?
Yeah. So I would say that there's a lot of challenges, right? The most important thing to be focused is to truly have that worthy purpose, whatever it is, as the North Star. And, as companies move, public companies or those in which have an investor base who are very focused on profits and ultimately, potentially, let's say it's a smaller company and they're looking for the proverbial exit. We want to have that end game, that
Hmm.
big
Yeah.
proverbial exit. It's a little bit like, all focus is on short term. What are we doing quarter over quarter to have better earnings, better profits, so that we can report them to our investors? Unfortunately, that creates a lot of trade-off thinking, and the trade-off thinking is actually what deteriorates a company over time. And without going through a long list of companies, we've seen that happen over the past many decades. CEOs at one point who were touted as like the best CEO ever, and then many years go by, actually not so many years go by, and all of a sudden we discover that the company was really being, the foundation was being kind of torn away because of the trade-off thinking. So when you use the word, and I use it all the time, a sustainable business, it is about not making that trade-off thinking, which is not easy. You've got to balance the needs of all stakeholders and look how to optimize that value. It's a really tough job. I think it's a worthy job. And I think we're beginning to see more people feel the responsibility of the job of being a CEO and addressing issues that we're all plagued with, whether we're in business or we're not. It's our children, it's our grandchildren, it's our parents who are still here on Earth. We've got to create a better environment for them to live in, and to create stronger communities.
Well, the young people are voting with their with their decisions because they're not having children. Not the same amount because they see a bleak. Thankfully,
Yeah,
mine are. I'm a lucky person.
yeah.
So let me ask you. I want to find out about what your business does before we end this program because that to me is really important.
Mhm.
But before we get into that, did you ever expect that what you've spent, decades of your life promoting a better business would become politicized? That the term stakeholder capitalism, which has the word capitalism in it for a reason,
Mhm.
would become a dirty word among people that are otherwise we would ordinarily respect and do business with.
Yeah, well, I certainly respect people's opinion around it. We've not seen a lot of the aspect of it being politicized. It's there, but it's more of a political tout, and it's not entering into the boardrooms and into the organizations of which we're engaged with, whether they're a client or through conversation. So I think there's something out there, certainly from a media point of view, that we've seen it. I would say where we're seeing it a lot more, of course, is ESG, the compliance area around it. And that's what we're seeing as politicized more. But the reality is, stakeholder capitalism is a way of looking at how to create more sustainable organizations, more sustainable business. And oh, yeah, they just happen to be more profitable. It's not soft work, it's very important work. And it's actually the way to be able to, a business case is to have more engagement from your employees, right? And when we look at engagement from employees, that's only one of many, that people want to work for the company. They're really coming in because they understand the purpose. There's something bigger that's happening in this organization they want to be part of. Customers are making that same decision. They want to work with companies that actually stand for something. And when we think about innovation, rapid innovation is coming from stakeholder companies because of the way in which they operate. And I think that's really extraordinary. And then we're seeing leadership performance with stakeholder companies. I'd say one of the biggest things that leaders need to be aware of today is this change, but it's their ability to be able to help manage the change, what needs to happen, to understand from that lens that that's a big part of their responsibility, because we're going through a period of time, not just because of stakeholder capitalism, but a lot of things. We've got to be able to manage that change, know how to lead through it, and lead through it in a way in which we always maintain high levels of trust, authenticity, transparency. And, there's lots of words that go with it, but those are some that are in caring. Those are some that are really important.
Well, you can't fake that. You cannot.
Mm.
And this, we're going to get to you in one more minute, but I wanted to ask you this.
Mhm.
I think one of the issues, and if you really study the history, which I have probably more than anybody, because no one really cares yet about stakeholder capitalism. There are only 718 followers on LinkedIn for stakeholder capitalism. Now, ESG, 15,000, but
Mhm.
they too come from a very similar history, by the way. That's another story. And many people don't know that it was 19 banks that created the term ESG. It was a
Mhm.
United Nations study, but it was done by 19 banks, including Goldman Sachs and some of the major banks. But anyway, getting back to this lack of definition, there is no definition, right? So what happened after two, and I'm going to get your views on this before we get to your business, because I think it's actually relevant. This has been a business that goes back. Deming, the total quality management expert, talked about engaging all of your stakeholders, and he wrote in about 1953 something along the lines that a great enterprise addresses the needs of all of its stakeholders toward a common purpose. Deming, quality management. Then, of course, Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, when he founded that, the Davos principles, which are not political. He doesn't talk in any way about getting involved with politics. And social is not meant as people unrelated to your business. It's the people in your community that you address. Then, of course, you have Professor Freeman from
Mhm.
Darden, right? And he didn't. I know him. He's not a friend, but I certainly know him. And I've read his work. He wasn't advocating for diverting shareholder money to pet causes, right? So all of this
Mhm.
somehow became politicized when the Business Roundtable published a press release with no any okay, here's what this really means. Here's our definition of stakeholder capitalism. They never even said what it was, right? So we're all supposed to change the charter of organization. Coincidentally, it's during a period of social unrest. So that's a long prelude to my question. Don't we really need to define it? And because what happened was that the people wanted to destroy it, defined it as, diverting the company's money to set social things, when I think a lot of other companies do that today, frankly. Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A, they advocate for their causes too. So my question to you is, isn't this lack of a definition kind of a problem?
Well, I think lack of definition I think it depends on what we're looking for and how defined we want the definition. Do we want it in a narrow way, or do we want it to be more in which we can really express and continue to evolve it? I happen to like one of the things Mark Benioff said, and we put him on our website because his quote is really strong and it's so simplistic. And sure, I could give the long definition that we tend to use even in stakeholder business. But in Mark's definition, the true purpose of a corporation is to create value for all its stakeholders. End of quote. And of course, that means not just shareholders, it means all stakeholders.
Yeah.
I think the thing that companies or individuals sometimes, and it hasn't entirely been my experience, but sometimes misinterpret is that, are you saying that all the stakeholders have to be evenly treated? No, not at all. What we're looking at is optimizing the value that stakeholders can receive without making a trade-off for a particular stakeholder. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this over here. I'm going to have to pay my employees less, or I'm going to not be able to give them raises, or, take away benefits that they have. That would be an example. I'm not saying everybody would go out and do that, but it's an example of a short-term trade-off to perhaps pay bigger dividends to the shareholders. What many organizations have discovered in that trade-off thinking, that that's actually contrary to having a sustainable business. I know for myself, even outside of societal community and environmental concerns, I want to be an investor of a business that's sustainable. I don't want to be one that kind of makes money and then loses money. It kind of goes out of business, or, it loses the real touch it has and it starts to wither. I want to be a part of a business. And I mentioned like some of the metrics before, where people are really thriving in that business. And so I think the notion, it is always about optimizing the value for stakeholders without making trade-offs. And that creates a much better economic outcome, not just for the company itself, communities that it serves, and the employees that work there. Companies also that have a sustainable business model over time have much better product. You could call it service, whatever you want. They have much better product service delivery and consistency in it. So we see a lot of great benefits. I mean, the list is fairly lengthy, documented, studied. I mean, it's studied and documented. So,
Well, ironically, Mark Benioff, I think he means really well, and I don't know him, but I have to tell you this, I think, is a great example of having helped create the confusion in stakeholder capitalism. I'll tell you how. One, he flew into Davos, right, in his jet, right? No one wants to hear about super wealthy people saving the world, number one. But number two, stakeholder capitalism is about how you treat your customers and employees. And while he has tremendous largesse and he gives away a lot of money, you don't want to deal with that company when they're coming up to a quarter. Let me tell you right now, they're going to hammer you. If you're, this is a letter, Mark Benioff, if you ever hear this, your company does this. Every quarter, their salespeople have to hit a sales target, and they ream and pound their customers, and they ream and pound their supply chain partners. And in such a way, I would not even call that a stakeholder capitalism company. So we'll move on that one. But to
yeah,
me,
because I want to say, I think that's an opinion since I've been a longtime customer for many years of Salesforce. I have
good.
family members who are very connected to Salesforce, own their own companies. I have a lot of experience around Salesforce. And I would say that that is one picture of what Salesforce might look like. I also think it's really important to distinguish the moment you and I start criticizing those who are doing a much better job than not doing anything at all is actually
Well
when
said.
we start to go
There.
reverse. Let's celebrate the things that they're actually doing well. Today, do I think, he's got himself into some tough situations today. And I don't think it's just the layoffs that are tough. During the pandemic, they saw a lot of opportunity for growth. They did see growth. They did a lot of promotions because they needed to have those people. Perhaps one of the things maybe Salesforce needed to do was to not move forward with the growth so fast. Maybe that's really the bigger issue that happened at Salesforce. And I won't go into it, but there's a lot of data points that might suggest that maybe they tried to grow to accept the growth too fast if they
I
had
think
pulled
you're
back.
quite right. And I really apologize for having digressed in this, because you're right. That was just my opinion. And number two, on a scale of 1 to 10 of capitalists, I'd have to put Mr. Benioff right up there and among the very best. So, let's move on to you. And tell me then, tell us how stakeholder business is helping companies make this transition. And really, I'm giving you a chance for an unabashed. I know you would do it professionally, but how do you create value for your clients, and who should come to you?
Yeah, so one of the things I like to share, because it takes us back just a step, and it's like we create the bridge to turn purpose into prosperity, because there is no stakeholder business without having that really deep, tested, stress tested purpose that engages all the stakeholders.
Right.
So I think that's kind of a really important piece for me to at least think about. When I think about stakeholder capitalism and getting started in the first step, it is really being aware that we need to have that purpose, and in that, it's our North Star. I like to say that purpose, and I'm quite one who's practiced this. That purpose is actually the most strategic decision that a company will make. It's certainly the most strategic decision that stakeholder business, that came up recently as an entity of itself with two business partners, we co-founded it, that even in our value set, our first value is return to purpose. So it's extremely strategic, and it's there to energize all the stakeholders, to get them involved. And if we can't measure our purpose, then there is no purpose. So we have to be really clear that we have to measure it. So step one is really developing in that purpose. So
So
for
your
mine,
client is always the CEO, always. You can't do
yeah,
anything with it. No
right.
HR, or sales and marketing, CEO.
Yeah, it's all for us, it's always the CEO, and then it engages the senior leadership team. And certainly it's all part of helping them be able to then work with others. It's certainly, as you know, it's a stakeholder approach, it's not a hierarchical approach. So sometimes we'll say, who are the change agents within the organization? And so it's working with that group of change agents, which are a lot like back in my days, and I still do some work on occasion helping companies selling at the executive level. In that one, there's this terminology that was coined by Dr. Bistrick called the relevant executive, the person who has the most to gain or lose. When I think about working with organizations, that person who has the most to gain or lose as a result of a buy decision is much like in an organization with a change agent. Not only do they want to show that they have the ability, but they feel personally convicted around the purpose, that conviction around the purpose, and they want to see that the company moves forward. So yeah, definitely the step one is making sure that the purpose is there. Step two is creating the stakeholder analysis engagement map. So we think of this as a roadmap, and it's really working with clients to understand who their stakeholders are. But as you know, it's not just as easy sometimes as saying customers, employees, suppliers, community, society, environment, shareholders. There's oftentimes subgroups within those. Understanding their particular needs and the symbiotic relationship, doing that analysis is important. And I know sometimes people think that's just something you sit back at your desk and do. No, of course, you include your stakeholders in that, representation of your stakeholders, and then develop your engagement plan for every one of those stakeholders and stakeholder groups. I would then say step three is cultivating your team alignment in buy-in. And I'd say that's something that a lot of people say, well, yeah, but I've been doing that all along. Again, that is a much deeper process, because we're getting them tied back to purpose. We're getting them also to understand what stakeholder engagement means, how to use it, how to operationalize it. So it's a lot about connecting those dots in the organization and operationalizing it. And then I would say from there, it's continuously measure and improve. And so the measurements are not the traditional measures that we've seen in annual reports, but I gave some hint to the others. Financial prosperity isn't just for the company, but it's for the stakeholders. We look at all the different measures. Environmental prosperity, I mentioned. How is the culture? Is it a thriving culture? So we begin to look at those, and then the companies represent what it is. So I know you had another question for me. I'll let you ask that question, because it's probably going to dovetail right into this one.
It will probably, because I was going to say, so I want to get into the process. So you've helped the company define, probably in an offsite or a retreat or whatever, the company's purpose with the right stakeholders. Maybe there's a development process for that. Number two, it would seem to me, you have to develop a plan, right? Or is this
Mhm.
so a written plan with metrics? Is that part of your service at some point?
Yeah. Yeah. So what happens is, let me give you an example. We have what's called the
Okay.
Stakeholder Business Acceleration Lab. It's a 12-month program.
Okay.
Every CEO is assigned a guide. I happen to be one of the guides. We have
Mhm.
guides. We're continuing to make sure that we have consultants to be able to serve in that role. And
Mhm.
we actually, as a guide, it's more about helping people through the process. The
Mhm.
next step is they actually come into Boulder for 2.25 days, and they're seeing our film, which is Beyond Zero, an amazing film chronicling the story of Interface Carpet in Atlanta. With Ray Anderson was the founder at the time and CEO for many years. And so using that, there are 15 points, let's call them lessons within that, that help illustrate an example of a sustainable company. And of course, Beyond Zero is indicating that it's not only is carbon neutral okay, but how do we now begin to be positive stewards? How do we give back to the environment versus taking from the environment as we operate our companies? So we go through that entire process, and there's lab work where the CEOs are during that session working in lab. They then turn around and they're working individually on their roadmaps. Their guides are there helping them see that they have this roadmap through these 4 pieces. And so for the next 10 months, what we're looking for is improvement around what they're looking for based on their roadmap is improvement. But something that distinguishes us is we have a methodology to do this. As you know, I've been around for a long time, and my other 2 partners have as well. So we have a methodology that's been used for many years. And number two, we have the power of having amazing films that chronicle stories. And there are more films and clippets coming out, or snippets, I should say, coming out this year of other stories that are just as amazing as Interface. And so going through that process, and at the end, we want to see these improvements, and we're chronicling their progression, what's working, what's not working. They have mastermind groups, we have experts come in, but we're chronicling everything that's going on. And we're then telling those stories so that other CEOs can be inspired by them, but begin to learn and understand. And then those who've achieved a certain level go on to the Stakeholder Business Society, which is something that we'll be launching soon. And that's like, if you're looking at like level 1 to 3 is kind of like I'm curious to starting to do something.
Mhm.
Level 4, 5 is wow, I'm really doing this work, but I need to understand more. I want to go deeper. There's more here I can be doing. This is really exciting. And I want to have bigger benefit. I also want to see greater profitability for my sustainable business. So there'd be a four, kind of a 4, 5. And then 5, 6 would be like, okay, I'm here, but we know the work isn't done. And that's when those individuals really lean into much deeper ways of helping to support even us in our company and the other people that we work with around the globe to do more great work. So more films, more seeing that our films are in the educational system, which they are
Right.
today. They're in Harvard and Yale and University of Michigan, Berkeley. They'll be throughout the world sooner than later.
Right.
And that's not only undergraduate, that's also graduate school. So we've got, you'd say, several different domains. I've only talked about 2 of them so far. And actually, only one of them, believe it or not, the consulting side, is actually part of where we want to help other consultants around the world to be a part of having access to these tools, to the
So to create, in a
methodologies.
sense, because you're going to run out of time quickly, and I want to cover this. So in other words, to enable, like sort of like a Six Sigma approach, where you license other people with your methodology to apply it in other places.
Yeah, we want to make sure that we create access to all that we're doing, because for us, we want to see that one way of saying it is the default mode of business around the globe is that of stakeholder capitalism. And so they're in our various domains that we're working on bringing it all together. The future leaders of companies is why this very robust curriculum is being used and why it's being rolled out. So we want to see that happening because they're the future leaders. Well, we're also working with corporate environments through our film, through other assets and engagement to help inspire their teams. And these companies that we're working with, for example, can be small or medium. It depends on which program. Also depends on where they are in the evolution. But we're also working with public, large global companies, with global presence, meaning major offices around the globe. And we're working with their CEOs and executive teams through our film and other resources.
Okay, so just winding up then, if I can sum it up, obviously your approach is strategic, systematic, purpose-driven. It's made to be ongoing, not a bright, shiny object, not ad hoc. It becomes part of your culture, and you are really functioning as guides to helping CEOs and their C-suite on this never-ending journey that includes continuous improvement. Is that sort of a nutshell?
I think that sounds great. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then you said, and then of course you're working to educate businesses. You're working, thank heavens, to educate our students because it's not taught anywhere. You and I both know that, or very little. University of Virginia, a few other places. Dartmouth, by the way, there's a professor there now. So what other two domains? I'm going to ask you one last question, but you said you're in 4 domains: students, business, what else?
Yes. Yes. So one of the domains will be, we're not actively working at, well, to some extent, we're working all of them, but not as a major active today, but working with associations, professional associations and organizations.
Great.
And we're doing some work right now, and that's going to expand. I now I have to go back through and think in order. Sources of capital. That's another one. So like KKR has been a great, partner in their portfolio companies having access to our film, being able to use that and understand it, and how to think differently about the companies in which they're working with, and how to help them move in a direction that's better meeting the needs of society today, how to choose which companies to be working with. So deployment of capital, business media. So business media will be where those who are working with us continue to have them and have the spotlight shined on them through a media point of view. And then, our ongoing chronicle stories are big. And I don't know if they'll all be, major award-winning films. And somebody said best, the best business story in the past 100 years, by the way, that's a co-CEO of a very large company who made that statement. I don't know that they'll all be award-winning films, but Beyond Zero is. It's being shown around the globe, and we want to make sure that more executives and senior leaders definitely are seeing that film, inspired by it, want to begin to take greater action in their own organization.
Well, great. And after the show, I'm going to quickly talk to you about how we can help you share that more. So finally, do you think I've been at this a very long time, I've seen a lot of fall summits. Do you think we're finally seeing an accelerated pace toward this sustainable approach to value creation for people? Is it accelerating, or do you think we have another 30 years?
No, it's definitely accelerating. More and more conversations are taking place. And what I would say is that there are so many organizations. It may be that our approaches are different, which is great. We believe that anybody who's starting to do the work and gets the support from various organizations, advisors, consultants, is the way to go. So the conversation is out there a lot more. I'm out speaking. I haven't done any speaking recently, but I've got a number of engagements signed up or lined up, I meant to say, next year. When I say next year, I always think of like taking most of the summer off. So it's like starting in the fall. And in those audiences, it depends on, I know what organizations, so I oftentimes speak to organizations. It depends on who's in the organizations, but it's no longer this notion of I've not heard of it. Most of the time, what I'm hearing is I've heard of it. I'm curious. I want to know more. And then with the larger companies, it's not so much that they're in our audience unless the audience is a screening of Beyond Zero. And then we might have 150, 100, 130 CEOs watching a film in a beautiful theater. Doesn't have to be beautiful, but because we're being given these theaters to be able to see that the film is being shown. And we're working on one in Boston right now. It has been screened in Boston, but we're working today, had a conversation. So there could be one of the most iconic, beautiful places in Boston might actually be one of the next showings during this calendar year. We have many showings coming up, including virtual showings of Beyond Zero later this month.
Well, so one last question. I'm always a believer that the best, when people do things because they want to do it, because they're inspired, you're always going to get the best results. But sadly, in being in business for 40 years, frankly, I only see change happen really when there's either a guy like Steve Jobs, just or Mark Benioff, just truly a genius who, or because people get their asses kicked, frankly, they get kicked or they get forced. They get forced, frankly. I mean, and the best change doesn't occur when you're forced to do something, than rather you want to do it. But nonetheless, I saw it with total quality management. This country did not address quality until the Japanese whipped our butts. They didn't. We ignored it. We built unhappiness into our cars. And you know what? We build it into our customer service now. Most people will tell you customer service generally stinks. So companies are just building unhappiness into their business model. They build high levels of turnover into their business model. So what's going to change it? Well, we think competitive pressures, right? We think, right? But now the Europeans have come along and they have done something that I don't think this country realizes yet is going to be a kick in the butt beyond belief. And that's called the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And basically, it's going to require probably 40 to 50,000 companies around the world, including every Fortune 500 company, to report on their turnover, on their diversity, and they're going to have to do it by law. And if they don't do it, they're going to pay fines and have a reputational embarrassment, if nothing else. And by the way, the database can be publicly available. So starting in 2025, anybody, and of course, all the business analysts are going to go in and scrape that database. So, and by the way, one of the things you're going to have to report on is the ratio of executive pay to the workforce, right? By the way, I know someone who works at Amazon who just found out that the CEO earns 247 times more than a low-level employees. And no joke, and this is a high level, I don't want to identify the guy. He's a very important person in that organization. He's thinking of leaving. He said I'm not going to work. He's a very talented guy. I don't need to work for a company like that. But anyway, getting back to this is all going to be public starting in 2025. Do you think that might be a little kick in the butt that we can no longer? Oh, and by the way, the disclosures aren't just for employees. They're for your supply chain. Remember the lessons your daddy taught you,
Sure,
right?
sure. They're for
They're
all
your
the
customers and your communities.
Yeah, well, as we certainly know, heavy force regulation doesn't work particularly well here in the United States. What I do think this is doing is saying, okay, this is a country, this is an area that's really interested in making some improvements, but they're choosing to do it through more of a compliance point of view. I believe strongly, and I don't have any issue with compliance. So I'm not trying to say I'm not saying I'm an advocate or not. It's like, let's just say I'm neutral at the moment.
I am
I
too.
believe that it's more important that leaders begin to understand what stakeholder capitalism is, understand the business case, understand how to make that bridge, what needs to be done, lean into it because the benefits are there and in extraordinary ways. I also believe that more and more people are going to become intrigued and we'll start hearing stories. It's not easy to be a stakeholder capitalism company, right? It's not easy. It's not easy. But at the same time, I think these stories are going to show up and they're going to say that, well, it wasn't easy. It is definitely more ethical. I feel much better about what we're doing, not just from the social point of view and environmental point of view, but as leaders, how I'm leading and the impact that it has within my employees. And we may begin to hear leaders, especially as they've been in their career for a while, start thinking about, wow, look at the impact that my participation, not me, but my participation has had toward X, Y, and Z. What is that impact? And they'll define what it is, but we know it will be solving worthy problems that we're all faced with here on Earth. So I think we may see it happen differently. I would be surprised we're going to see a heavy-handed. If anything's in the media right now, ESG is getting hit hard. To me, that's a very compliance-oriented issue. It's a lot like regulation.
Oh, I agree.
Also, it helps, meaning what helps is ESG, right? But ESG is not a business model. It's not stakeholder capitalism. It's an initiative that's held out on the side. And frankly, many organizations will lean more into it or pull from it to meet the needs in other areas. And I would say that's actually one of the bigger challenges that's unspoken about with ESG. And we could say that about other models. Now, again, that doesn't mean I don't think ESG isn't positive for helping people to begin to understand what's really important and necessary, but it's not the same as having a business model that creates a sustainable company, because ESG does not have anything to do with a sustainable business model, in
Well,
my
it's
opinion.
interesting. If you read the the original UN report, and we just published it, it actually does. It was written by bankers, and it's really been twisted and confused. All they basically say in this report, a lot of words that basically say you cannot have a sustainable business unless you address the needs of the stakeholders that create value for you. That these are
Mm.
but it's neither here nor there. The bottom line is what the point you're making is that you can't just talk about it. It's a system, and you have to be committed to it, starting at the top, and it's a never-ending journey. And that the whole ESG has unfortunately, in a sense, distracted the discussion away from what your point is, and I couldn't agree with you more. So, Kent, thank you so much. We're going to share. Well, this will be published, as you know, in an article. We're going to tell people how to contact you. And after we end this, I want to quickly get some resources that we can share with our readers, including perhaps the snippets of your movie. So, Kent, thanks again for taking the time to share your thoughts with me today.
It's great to be here, Bruce, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, and just stand by.